Olá, Tutamé está ao vivo, como sempre trazendo para você uma figura, uma personagem, um homem, uma mulher que nos ajude a compreender melhor o mundo em que vivemos, para que a gente possa atuar melhor, trabalhar melhor, viver melhor nesse nosso planeta Terra. Ela é a Eleonora.
Ele é o Rodolfo.
E ela é a Shirley, que vai estar conosco nessa conversa, falando sobre luta contra o racismo, luta por direitos humanos. A Shirley Gunn é da África do Sul. Ela foi militante da resistência armada contra o regime racista do apartheid na África do Sul. Sobreviveu, conseguiu a vitória, como os sul-africanos tiveram essa vitória nos anos 90, e hoje ela é diretora do Centro de Mídia de Direitos Humanos na África do Sul, e acaba de lançar lá, e trouxe aqui para o Brasil, o livro Vozes da Clandestinidade, Voices from the Underground, que vou botar aqui, depois eu vou mostrar com mais detalhes. Ela fez ontem, aqui em São Paulo, uma apresentação do livro, a apresentação do seu trabalho, um pouco da apresentação da sua história, que é o que nós vamos ouvir hoje aqui, né? Só lembrando que ela está no Brasil apresentando o seu livro e está no Brasil participando do encontro anual da Rede Latino-Americana e Caribenha de Lugares de Memória. Neste ano, o encontro, a conferência, a assembleia aí da RESLAC, que é a sigla aí dessa rede, recebeu esses visitantes, esses que vieram trazer depoimentos de lugares fora da América Latina e do Caribe. Tiveram presentes no encontro a Shirley Gunn e a Bernadette French, que é da Serra Leoa. Mas bem, vamos logo começar a entrevista, que ela vai nos contar muitas histórias aí. Ontem a gente ficou bastante emocionado com algumas dessas histórias. E eu vou começar perguntando a ela sobre a questão do apartheid mesmo. A entrevista vai ser toda em inglês. Quem puder, tiver tempo, quiser fazer seus comentários, colocar a tradução nos comentários, a gente agradece. Não deu tempo aí de juntar gente que pudesse dar essa ajuda. Se você puder, já colocando nos comentários alguma tradução, alguma versão em português do que diz a Shirley, será legal. De qualquer forma, no nosso site, no Tutameia, o endereço é tutameia.jor.br, a gente vai fazer uma transcrição em português da entrevista, que vai ficar disponível também para você ver e rever no nosso canal de vídeo, o Tutameia TV. Vá lá, se inscreva, clica de sinetinha e fique atento aí ao jornalismo dos Tuts. Shirley, thank you very much for being with us tonight. We'd like to start, as we said. Could you please talk a little bit for us about what was apartheid in South Africa?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me on this program. Wow, it's quite complex to explain the atrocity of apartheid declared by the UN as a crime against humanity, where every single layer of society was divided along racial lines. White people were privileged, and colored and Indian people were in the middle and on the lower rung, with little prospect of anything more than a laborer was stuck on the bottom, the majority of people who are black. So this system of apartheid, I can't say it started during the period of Afrikaner nationalism in the country in 1948. because I think colonial structures also imposed something very similar. Indigenous people there was genocide in our country, which hasn't been acknowledged, and conquests and oppression prior to the period. Oh, let me just add, we had two colonizers, the Dutch and the British. But in 1948, the Afrikaner nationalist government came into power and put all these apartheid laws into place. It was illegal for a mixed couple, to have a relationship. You could not fall in love with somebody who was of a different color. How absurd. And the prospects of privilege were completely skewed in the favor of the white population, which was a very small percentage of the people, 20%. And as I said, every single layer of society was divided along racial lines. Community were separated along race. There was no opportunity for mixing at all. You could find a black servant in a white house, commuting back and forth, or maybe sleeping in. But the society was completely polarized and divided along lines of race and deep discrimination. And, we have a long trajectory of struggle in our country because the ANC was established very, very early on, and but 1960 was a turning point. And it was the point at which, after when the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress realized that peaceful resistance was not working in the country. And both of these liberation movements at that point in 1960 took a decision to take up arms. So we know the story of Nelson Mandela.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he was our commander-in-chief. And he was, soon after he was involved in the military underground, he was arrested and tried and sentenced to life with the other comrades of his Rivonial trialists. And he was sent to an island off Cape Town called Robben Island, along with many of the other political prisoners sentenced with him. And, opposition to apartheid was brutally crushed. But the ANC, in different waves, got stronger and stronger, and especially in 1976, with the uprisings of the students in the country after the clashes between students and the police in 76 in Soweto, and actually across the country. There was a mass exodus of South Africans, young South Africans, who left the country to be trained, to follow in the footsteps of the leaders who were incarcerated. Well, I mean, there were various detachments, but there was a mass exodus in 76, and so the struggle, the military struggle, the armed struggle, which was only one of the four major arms of our resistance, it was strengthened through waves of repression. And so I was of the 1980s batch. And you might wonder why I, as a white woman from a middle-class family, would resort to arms as well. Well, you know, my story is published in the book, Voices from the Underground, and it is actually the first chapter of the book, and it's called Truth is Like a Cork. And I come from a middle-class family. My parents were in the medical field, my mother a nurse, my father a doctor. And I was educated in a convent school. And I was fortunate in the sense that I wasn't given the government education. It was a different form of education. And so, you know, the standard of education for white people, government schools, was way higher than it was for colored students. And, of course, the type of education for black youth or students was called gutter education. That was its nickname because it didn't promote you beyond a labourer at most. It kept you at the lower rungs to benefit the capital. It was racial capitalism that we had in place. It was untenable. Any person with a conscience could not live with themselves in the country, and I couldn't. So I was involved in the mass democratic struggle for many years, actually.
When you say mass democratic struggle, what
do I
did
mean?
you do?
I suppose my activism started more profoundly when, as a student, and you know, when I was studying sociology, psychology, and social work, and the practical component of social work put me into communities that were ghettos, and you know. There was absolutely, it was a useless job, I could see, treating the casualties of capitalism. And I didn't want to be part of it. And I, in fact, specialized in what is called community social work, rather than group work or casework. So in my practical work, I began mobilizing. I began seeing, well, you know, the problem here is the high rentals. And the formative placement was in a fishing village in Hout Bay, a community, and the work was seasonal. But if you live in a council dwelling, house, cottage or flat, you have to have rent every single month. And how can seasonal workers pay monthly rentals? And you know, over the years, the workers had paid over and over the value of the house, yet they were being bled dry. Whatever they earned from the fishing industry, they were paying over to the council for electricity and rent. And it was a bitter existence. And
Almost as slavery.
yes, absolutely. There's no other word. So it was necessary to organize the community and to oppose a system that was robbing them, and unfair labor as well. So the workers in the factories saw these as their issues. They were unionized and radicalized through their unionism, but they saw too that, yes, these issues in the community are our issues, and we can't only struggle on the factory floor, because whatever we're trying to get right in the factory floor and get a little bit more every year over the negotiation table is taken away by the state. And this is our struggle. And the workers in their boots and their turbans, they marched from the factories to the rent office to oppose the rental system. And so solidarity between the workers and the residents and the tenants association was strengthened, and an action committee was taking up the issues, and the youth formation, the youth was organizing around its issues, because these these communities weren't geared to the expansion of natural life. That what happens, where does the son and the daughter and the grandchildren live? And everyone were living in like sardines with no development plan whatsoever, but just in eyesight from the fishing village was the luxurious valley dwellers living in acres of land and beautiful houses. And so the contradictions were so there in front of everybody, and very soon this sleepy community became incredibly well organized and linking up with the struggles along the Cape Flats, because although at the time there were two different divisional council and city council managing the communities, the oversight bodies, we forged this unity. So we formed an umbrella body called CAAC, the Cape Areas Housing Action Campaign, and eventually CAAC became part of the UDF, and the UDF was a huge, massive umbrella body of workers and students and residents and teachers and traders, and everybody was under this fighting to overthrow apartheid by making it completely ungovernable. That was the mass democratic struggle. It was incredibly successful. Everyone, in all sectors of society, it was a river unstoppable. And so that was the major pillar in our liberation struggle. And
the mass movement.
Absolutely. And there was, as communities became better organized and mobilized around important campaigns, some of them highly political, in that, you see, the government wanted to pretend to the world that, we're allowing a certain representation of coloured people and Indian people in our government system. There's a House of Representatives and a House of Delegates, and these are all cronies of the apartheid state. And we opposed the elections, and there was, I think, 2% votage, and yet these two different structures were set up to pretend to the world that, it's not only the whites that can vote in this country. And so, some of the campaigns were really political, and the release Mandela campaign, for example, who was in Robben Island with his comrades, and as the struggle became more intensified, so the oppression became worse and more intense, and state of emergencies were imposed, and organizations, including the UDF, was banned eventually and couldn't operate. So even the mass democratic struggle had to operate from the boots of their cars in a clandestine way, and it was unstoppable, completely unstoppable. But parallel to that, we have to acknowledge the other pillars of our struggle, which were the international solidarity. And, as South Africans who were terrorized by the apartheid state exited into exile, they set up offices across the world, London, Paris, New York, all over, and Germany, Russia, Soviet Union at the time, all over. There were officers organizing the campaign against apartheid.
The boycott.
The boycott. Exactly. So that was a very important leg. Then there were two other legs. The one was the political underground, because the ANC and the Communist Party, the African Nationalist Congress, I shortened to ANC for the listeners, because the ANC was banned and the Communist Party was banned, there was a lot of political work that had to be done, and it had to be done clandestinely. So that was another leg of the ANC's work, political underground work. And that is where I began in the early 80s. And then in 1984, I was recruited into the military underground, contra, the spear of the nation. And I was trained inside the country initially.
But were there other white people in these detachments, the military detachments?
Well, there were, you see. Well, in the military detachments, let me just say, in the mass democratic struggle, there was a white left, well organized, from universities that had, maybe their political grounding was much more theoretical than mine was. That was really on the face of the evidence of the harm that I saw in my work, in my life, in my involvement in mobilizing. It was brutal, and there was no turning back. So, there was a women's organization called the United Women's Organization based in Cape Town, and there were branches in white communities too. So there was solidarity, and this was what the ANC had found and founded a home for all freedom-loving people, regardless of your color. And because that was the vision of our future, that we would be one nation and not a divided nation. And so there were, but when it comes down to the deeper work, the underground work, I would say, not many. And our mandate, the subtitle of our story is called The Ashley Creel Detachment, 18 Life Stories of Umkhonto we Sizwe's Ashley Creel's Detachment. So we were instructed to build the underground in the white, colored, and Indian communities, not in the African Black African communities around in our province, partly because we would be a little bit visible, and so it was quite hard to recruit white people into the detachment. Some approaches that I had made were not successil, and I didn't stick my head out too far because it's a risk every time you approach somebody. And so the bulk of our members were from the working class backgrounds on the Cape Flats and its surrounds, from coloured and Indian communities. So in answer to your question, yes, there were. white people who were committed to giving their life to a cause, but not that many.
And what can you tell us a bit about your work in this military detachment? What kind of operations did you have?
We bombed. Well, let me go to a little bit of the background of some of the members. So Anis was officially the commander. I was co-commanding with him, and he trained in Angola. He was forced out by the way in which he was a journalist. And the company that he worked for had colluded with the security police, and he realized he had no option but to leave the country eventually, actually. And I was, at that point, organizing clothing workers behind the clothing factory, behind machines, making our clothes, and most were women. In huge factories. There were a lot of clothing factories in the Western Cape. It was a huge employer of women, and I was an organizer in the clothing for
Workers.
Yes. And in 1985, I was detained for 112 days in solitary confinement. I was already in the underground, in the military underground. I had been trained inside the country, and I had received instructions from Zimbabwe, actually, earlier in the political underground, and that had made my life a little bit difficult because the way I would receive money, communication, letters, the dead letterbox seemed to have been picked up with the security police somehow. So anyway, I served a number of months in solitary confinement in Pollsmoor prison at the time when Nelson Mandela was in maximum security very close by. And with other Rivonial trialists. So they'd been removed from Robben Island and taken to Pollsmoor. We had organized marches to Pollsmoor in solidarity and demanding his release. And this was prior to my arrest. And so when I was coughed out from solitary confinement and charged with possession of Communist Party literature, which I got off thanks to my good lawyers. And I continued working in the clothing industry as a trade unionist. It became absolutely impossible to work in any legal way any longer because I had the security police surveilling me 24/7 and blatantly and aggressively. It was nerve-wracking, actually.
And what was your health state at the time? Because, I mean, you had been almost 4 months in solitary and tortured.
Well, I had been nearly 4 months, not 1 month, in solitary confinement. My health was good. Fortunately, I have always been physically very active and fit, and I've tried to somehow maintain a level of fitness which has stood in my favor. So, I think any experience in solitary confinement and being interrogated very regularly by the security police with all their intimidation tactics and the way in which they try to trick you into writing confessions and so forth. It was hell, but I survived it and I came out stronger. And, it's contrary to what they they would achieve by detaining and interrogating and terrorizing people. They want you to stop what you're doing. But in fact, it made us stronger to continue. And it made me stronger. So about 6 months after I was released from detention, I then exited the country clandestinely and via Botswana. And
now are you under cabbages?
yes, I was under cabbages in a truck. Yes, yes. So it was
Sneaky?
Yes. They have sniffer dogs at the border posts, and they walk around the truck, and you don't breathe at all, and eventually when you get the go ahead, you can expel, you can breathe. So I got out safely and met up with the ANC in Botswana, and then had a long journey on foot over from Botswana to Zimbabwe to Limpopo to Zambezi River. I crossed over in a canoe, waiting in the reeds, crocodile infested, and patrolled day and night, and silently these oars are going through the water to get you across in the pitch dark when the moon is just a little thread in the pitch dark. And so my journey then went up to Lusaka in Zambia, and I got in further instructions after briefings that I would be sent to Cuba, Havana, to be trained in military intelligence and security. I'd come from a situation that I could manage, so it was good that I had extra expertise in espionage, counterintelligence, to outwit the enemy and be sent back home. It was excellent training. It saved my life. So, one course that I really liked was the underground photography course. Wow. Where we actually observed with telescopic lenses a building and had to try and monitor the movement from one flat in and out and so forth. It was quite fascinating. You had to be on watch over a period of time, and we printed the prints in the toilet in the underground house that we were being trained in, and it was all in Spanish and translated into English, and the exercise, the practical exercise, was my best as well, because we got a little bit of money to get bus tickets to get to a community where we'd be doing our military practical training, or we would pull off our something that we remarked, an exercise. And so it was Marianao that I was sent to. And with my background, community social worker, interested in how a community thrives and organizes, and it was fascinating how this community, the shops down the road and the psychiatric hospital and the medical houses with the doctor's surgery at the bottom and their residents above, and the community notice boards, and the houses that were looking so ununiform, like at home every single unit looked the same. People living in sub-economic houses couldn't drill a nail into the wall without permission from the council, but these houses were painted and bright, and extensions, and it was so vibrant, and the queues with the tokens for people to get food. Nobody was hungry at all. The children coming from school could only be identified by the bow tie, which was a different color. Otherwise, it was a white shirt. and grey pants or khaki pants, just to distinguish the school. There was no elaborate school uniform that would cost a lot of money. It was practical. It was working. The people looked happy. Everyone was fed and housed. I just wished every single day that the workers that I had organized could experience what I was experiencing. And I had to map this out on a big piece of card that was the size of this table. Of course, this is my expertise. So I had such fun, actually. I was back to that community, memorizing each alley, each footway, footpath, the number of houses, exactly what kind of shops were there that could support the daily living and lifestyle of people. It was fantastic. And so that was one of the assignments, and the other 3 men that were in the course had been in exile for a long time, and this was not quite up their alley, so I took to the task. And then the other exercise in Marinal was a handover of a clandestine handover. It was not something like a pistol or something, but it was something you had to create and hand over to somebody else in a clandestine way. And you had to work your route check and find your route and where you do it, and have plan A and plan B. So you wouldn't be seen. It was done perfectly. And so that was the other part of the practical. And you had to present it to a lineup of generals at the end of the table, and they were clearly observing the entire thing. So they knew that the report that I'd given was perfectly accurate. Because I had to go to plan B. There was some activity. Yes. So I came from Cuba back to Africa, to Angola, and was sent to a general training camp where you are given politics, a very important subject, politics, firearms, military combat work, and engineering. So being the only white person in the camp of 80 and only one of 4 women, I was trained on my own at my own pace, because if you're in a small group, there's exposure and risk. So it was done very quiet at my own pace. I did a lot of firearms training. And as I said at the book launch in Sao Paulo, I was a very good shot, and I'm very glad I didn't have to pull the trigger. So after that training, I went to Lusaka and received some other specialized training before I came back into the country, where I'd linked up with Anis, who had come from Angola. He was trained as well. And then slowly we built... Anis had recruited Chenille, the other editor, to set up a rear base, and he would be responsible for collecting the arms in cars, in hired cars. Skylines were great. The car, a Skyline, a Nissan Skyline, because it had panels that you could pack a whole lot of limpets and grenades and AK-47s and Makarov pistols and communication, and not even the sniffer dogs could detect it. It was perfectly concealed. So we had to go in and out and fetch the hardware that we needed for our operations back home at the bottom tip of Africa in Cape Town. So we had a base in Johannesburg, a unit in Johannesburg. So we communicated there to Johannesburg. Johannesburg communicated outside, because a direct line from Cape Town to Botswana was risky. So there was greater traffic happening from Johannesburg and Botswana, which is way closer, up and down all the time. That was a clever move. So slowly, between Anis and I, we managed certain operations, and sensitive ones as well. And my story starts off with one in the castle, this iconic castle built by the Dutch East India Company.
In 1600s?
Yeah. And it's 5 stars, and it was a military headquarters of the Western Cape Command, and this is the start of my story, is the operation in the castle. So, I walked with a limpet in a handbag, wearing a sun hat and a summer dress, straight through the guards.
You weren't checked?
I wasn't checked. You know, maybe they didn't suspect a white woman.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in my route check, to check I wasn't surveilled or there was no strange things happening around me, you do a little route check before you get into go to your target. I bought a bunch of flowers at the flower shop. It's an open-air flower shop on Adderley Street, the main street in Cape Town, because if you hold a bunch of flowers, you could kind of hide your face, you know. So I had a sun hat, a bunch of flowers, and who would think that somebody looking like a tourist would have a limpet in their handbag in a custard box? So it was a tricky operation because the castle was under renovations. It was a Friday. The workers were knocking off, but somehow it was just taking time for them to clear out of the area. And I had to improvise, actually. We weren't quite sure. There was no clear place where I would place it. And I sussed out on my feet at the moment that in the tunnel, which was open because of the renovations, if I zipped in there, it was like divided this star, this huge big stone castle, surrounded by a moat, right? You get it. It's like they're secure enclave there. But there was a section in the middle that had a tunnel, and the doors were open. They weren't open before, but they were open that day. And I zipped inside one of these doors, placed the limpet against one of the walls inside, and came out slowly and exited through the flowers in a bin at the taxi rank, and I jumped on a bus, got to Sea Point. From there, a taxi which is like not a paid taxi that you pay a lot for. We didn't have that kind of money. People's taxi, combi, a VW, those big cars, to where I was staying, our safe house in Clifton, and there we monitored the news, and it made a big bang. Everyone in Cape Town could hear this explosion. It caused some structural damage, and more than that, it demoralized them.
Yeah, that's the question. You said that your operations didn't intend to kill anyone or to have any casualties. What was the goal of this military operation then?
Well, all of them, and we executed more than 30 in the time that we were operative, from 1987 to February 1990. The last operations were on the day that Mandela was released. We gave negotiations a chance. We had 3 operations that night. That was it. But we were still combat ready, because that period in the 90s was treacherous, actually. There were more fatalities and injuries in that time because, there was the right wing was not happy about this at all. And
paramilitary people were working too.
Sorry?
Paramilitary,
yes.
Not only the military, but...
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, not the paramilitary, because we didn't really have we didn't have a paramilitary, but what the apartheid security forces did wickedly was that they infiltrated, they created division between different ethnic black people, Xhosa and Zulu, and created scenarios that ultimately ended up in black-on-black violence, but it was instigated by the apartheid state. And there were terrible skirmishes and massacres and horrible things that happened in certain pockets of the country in that period, 1990 to 1994, when we voted for the first time.
But you were saying, talking about the
operations.
The operations,
yes.
And all that. Okay.
So I jumped to the last ones, but in between the 36 odd that we had implemented or pulled off successfully, I suppose it's also the kind of humanitarian and intellectual background that we had, that it wasn't necessarily the absolute policy of the African Nationalist Congress. I mean, it was don't kill civilians, and that is just not on. But if a soldier or two had been injured in the castle, that would not have been seen to be a problem. But we tried our utmost in this detachment, the Ashley Creel detachment, not to injure anybody, but to go for their buildings. We went for the structures of apartheid, and the castle was a deeply humiliating operation, and quite shocking to them that they were so insecure.
So in a way, they were actually a propaganda operation. They are military, but they are also a kind of propaganda operation, so that you humiliate the government and.
No, I think we were much more than a propaganda. Us?
Yeah.
No. There's let's kind of look at the range of operations that took place. So, Dulcie September was working in the ANC office in Paris when she was assassinated. Now, later we've got to the bottom, or not quite who pulled the trigger, but that she was deeply involved in research around how the French was bolstering the apartheid state. She was assassinated outside the door of her office. Now, we had to send out a message to governments abroad and the South African government, whoever pulled the trigger, whoever cooperated in those kinds of that attack particularly, that we will not tolerate this. So we hit the French Bank in Cape Town. Actually, there's this funny story to that because it's right next to Parliament, and the apartheid government thought that we hit them. But it was the French Bank. The French Bank actually withdrew from that. They withdrew their operation. Then, municipal elections were often managed through the civic centres across the Cape Flats. So, that's where voting would take place. So we hit the voting stations. We hit these centres. And the courts that were metering out unjust sentences, and also cooperating with, there was no independent judiciary at all in our country, not at all. So there were a range of courts, and there were a range of civic centres and rent offices. There was a huge, big strike of transport workers. If I go into the complexity, it could take well too long, but the South African government didn't recognise this trade union, and the union were in a deadlock with a reactionary state-structured union, and there was the striking workers had been injured, and there had been a couple of deaths in this struggle for recognition, and we bombed the railway lines in support of the SATS workers. So it was always in support. We didn't drive, we supported what was happening on the political level. Mm-hmm. It was so unlike the apartheid state that was actually run by the generals and the army. We were in the backseat. We were monitoring the news all the time and supporting the struggles that were happening on the ground. And you didn't have to, it was, senseless to take out any people in this whole operation. It was the structures that reinforced all this apartheid that we were dismantling. We were part of dismantling. And so we also had a number of operations at the very same time. So, the police would go helter-skelter in different directions and not really know. They knew, we've got units based in communities all over, and they just would not know how to crack this particular detachment. And they never did. They never did.
But you were arrested a second time.
I was. So let me get to that. So the very last operations were actually in support of the rebel tour. Despite the sanctions that we've already spoken about, there was a rebel tour coming to South Africa playing cricket, the English squad against the South African squad, and it was held in Newlands. One of the cricket grounds where the test match was to be played was in Newlands, and within earshot of where Nelson Mandela would be sleeping that night, we hit the turnstiles. The rebel tour was cancelled. Now, there was a lot of other operations and were organized levels, various range of organizing against the rebel tours, but, that's really hitting the heart of it. And so, we pulled off a number of operations with simple limpet mines and which are of Soviet Union origin. So it's come a long way to get all the way to Cape Town, where we secured our armory in a very good way, buried safely, and we could hand over most when it came to the time when we got to a point of the armed struggle is over. But it was not over when Nelson Mandela was released. It was not over. We were still in our base and in our position. So I had a beautiful baby boy, Anis and I, in the underground. His name was Haroon. So he was about 15 months old when in around June of 1990, after Mandela was released and political prisoners were released and exiles were returning, the negotiations were on the road, on a healthy road. And I had made some very clandestine opportunity to link up with my mother and my sister and her little boys, just to have some kind of connection with normal life, especially with a young boy who, the ANC was unbanned. So although we were still at our post. And, that is a story, and I just wish this book was in Portuguese, because I think that it's a riveting read, actually, if I may say so myself. And all of them are, all of these stories, because we are ordinary people. If if you line us up, you wouldn't say we are.
Guerrillas.
Exactly. And a lot of the other members of the detachment actually came from a liberation theology perspective. They had deeply committed Christians. A couple were Muslims, and who through deep reflection and the mobilization of progressive churches in the country, had arrived at that decision that the armed struggle was something that was Christian. And so wonderful and young comrades joined the ranks of the Ashley Krill detachment, and we trained most people inside because there's risk when you trained outside. There's a lot of exposure along the way, so it's better just do it at home. We're quite capable of doing the training, and so I think that also helped to secure people because they didn't have too much exposure, and most lived semi-underground and underground lives, but some of us lived fully underground lives, for a long period. So I must say that the winds of change that happened in the 1990s did lift some pressure off us, and the opportunity to meet my mother and my sister went terribly wrong. I managed to survive that, but we were arrested. That was not the plan of the police who got us at the farm that we were.
To kill.
Yes, they were absolutely. They'd staked out the place. There was no place for our bags. Their boots were filled with these metal cases of arms. It's a long story. You have to read the book. So, where do you pick up your life after this? Detention, life in the underground, it's a hard life. You're your own jailer, so we really were extensive years in prison, really. Out of circulation, monitoring the news, a very rigorous routine which we had to stick to, because if we wavered and detoured for that could cost us our lives. One of the very important bridges in South Africa from our violent past, oppressive past, to a democratic, hopeful future was this Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established by Act in 1995 and then put into effect from 1996 and 1998 on the 30th of October, nearly today's date, actually, almost to the date, 21 years ago. The gross human rights violation hearings had been completed by the Gross Human Rights Violation Committee, one of the 3 committees of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I participated in that. Because in the second time I was detained with Haroon, we were both tortured, and that's quite a story.
Was then 15 months.
15 months, and you don't have it's not a normal life. He was an active breastfed boy, baby, toddler at that stage still, and he was abducted by senior social workers wrenched from me and taken to a place of safety in Cape Town, and I was stuck in the cells, and my conscience and my guilt raging because you're not cooperating, you're not going to cooperate, you're not going to sell out your comrades, but your child is in this miserable condition. They're bringing tape recorders of his voice and telling me that I'm a terrible person and mother because, if I just cooperated with them, then he would be returned to me, etc. You can imagine. Anyway, I understood their tactics, and I knew that my lawyers and the community was not going to stand still. Neither my mother, who had witnessed my detention, and my sister and the community were going to do something, and they did. They mobilized, marched, petitioned, and had a special court hearing in the Supreme Court in Cape Town to have Haroon returned to me. But in the gap when he was separated, I used my breast milk as a weapon against the security police. And that's another story, but it was all I had. Absolutely. How? Well, it was winter, and if you just stop breastfeeding, your breasts are going to get engorged, so you have to express the milk. And so that's what I did. I was in the hands of the security police day, every single day. They obviously, Haroon's not here with me, so they're intensifying the interrogation. And so then I would say, whoa, I'm in pain. I need hot water so I can express my milk, please. So these men, dithery and bit taken aback, arranged that these basins of hot water was brought into the room. They had to exit. Female security police were in my presence, and a kind cleaner who brought in these basins of hot water. And when they cooled, I asked for more, but I expressed the milk into these pans of water. So a little bit of milk in these waters make it look like a whole bucket of milk, you see. You understand? So it was taken out, these basins, round big basins of milky water were taken out of the interrogation room past the police, and and clear water was brought in, milky water came out, milk, buckets of it. So, they're seeing this, they think, oh my God, and by the time they come back into the interrogation room, they don't really know where to pick up the conversation. So it was, the reason, that's how I managed that situation. I could have gone on a fast, what did I have at my disposal? That was my leverage. Anyway, we were released and had to get on with our lives. Anis was still in the underground, 100%. I was in the semi-underground now, doing some work for the comrades, but low-key, keeping a really low profile for quite a long time until the rest of the people got indemnified and could emerge out of the underground, and there was a case of handing in our arms, all of it that we had stored safely. That was done. That was over. Then came the TRC. So I spoke about the way I was tortured and the assassination plans and plots that I had evaded in the time, and both Haroon and I were found to be victims of gross human rights violations. And our names are in the final report, you can read. But, I was not prepared after that, making a public statement to the TRC. Only 2,000 of the 22,500 statements, human rights violation statements, were on public platforms. The rest is written and difficult to access, actually. You have to go through a whole process to access any of that information. So immediately after testifying, I was approached for interviews. And I gave them generously lots of different media and lots of different interested academics who were writing their PhDs about the South African Truth Commission. Chile had had the first, we had had the second. The world was interested. How was this restorative justice form of dealing with the past going to work? And for quite a number of years, I was doing a number of interviews, and I realized, no. This is not right, actually. Nobody is trained in dealing with trauma that I'm speaking to, so I'm going to think about the importance of our narratives in raising awareness, and public education work must happen, must be done, but not this way. And at the same time, I was also involved or drawn in, because now I've been part of the TRC. I'm drawn into a committee called the R&R Committee, Rehabilitation and Reparations Committee. And that was very interesting. For about 1.5 years, every month, we met, a group of us in the Western Cape and in Durban and in Johannesburg and in another base. There were 4 different bases. Groups of people were meeting to think and contemplate and look at what reparations could and should look like from very many different angles, from an anthropological angle, from a religious angle, from a legal angle, from the experience that we could draw from, which was Chile, and that was the first thing that I read on, to lots of different angles. And at the end of the day, how do you compensate? It's a very difficult question. And then we also had an actuarial scientist who was saying, well, if you do it this way, this is what it will cost. If you do it that way, that's how much it will cost. And this is how much there is currently in the President's Fund, which was designated for reparations. But there were 5 legs eventually included in the whole recommendations that the Truth Commission had handed over to the South African government during the time of Nelson Mandela, just at the end of his first reign, 4 years in government, and he received 5 volumes, and the reparations recommendations are in there. And so, to cut a long story short, that got me thinking about the complexity of compensation of victims. And, in a country that's resourced, like maybe Germany, it would look like that. In a country like South Africa, it would look like this. In a poorer country, well, much less. But it has to happen. Legally, it has to happen. If in our situation where there was amnesty given for the full truth of perpetrators, they would receive amnesty if the amnesty committee, the 3rd committee of our Truth Commission, had heard the evidence and come to an agreement that, or an opinion that the statement by the policeman or the army, whoever it was full and politically motivated, etc. There were 5 criteria. They would be given amnesty. But that meant that with that amnesty, the state, the South African state, was legally bound to pay for reparations. So now I'm coughed up. I've got victim tattooed on my forehead through the TRC. I didn't ever see myself as a victim, actually. I was an activist, and I still am today. But that process identifies you as a victim. So I identified and started working and mobilizing the victim community. And that was another trajectory. We marched, we protested, we said, don't close the doors of this office. You haven't heard all the testimonies that you need to hear around gross human rights violations. There are queues of people who have got statements to make. Don't close your office. Anyway, the problem was that the Amnesty Committee's work had been sluggish. I think the cops and the security forces were watching to see, how is this thing going to play out? Let us just carry on shredding information here. Let's destroy documents. And it was happening right up until 1996. Critical evidence was being shredded. And so they knew what would stand in a court of law in terms of the evidence eventually. So slowly, there were hearings, amnesty hearings, and about less than 4,000 were heard. Of those, 850 or something were given amnesty. But the rest, no. They weren't given amnesty. So if they weren't given amnesty, what then? That is then handed over to the National Prosecuting Authority to further investigate and prosecute. So that was our expectation of this amnesty committee. If they made a finding, you get amnesty, you don't, then continue the investigation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the Amnesty Committee's work went on until 2002. And there were 2 more additions added to the report. So there are now 7 volumes, not 5, 7. And at this point, we've got Thabo Mbeki as president, Nelson Mandela, who's apologized to the nation for the wrongs of apartheid. Clearly, he wasn't responsible, but he's a statesman. He is now responsible, and the new government is responsible for the acts of the past. You don't have to feel bad about pressing the new government for claims that belong to the past. No guilt, do it. And so eventually, there was just nothing coming from the National Prosecuting Authority. We just thought there was no political will. Final reparations paid out December 2003, less than a quarter of what the TRC had recommended. We thought, they just don't take this seriously. It was equivalent to less than 1,000 USDs per victim that was finally given in that package. Incredibly disappointed. Medical bills that people have accumulated has exceeded that amount. But the prosecution angle has been a worry because there was just silence and there was no progress. And it's only recently in South Africa that progressive lawyers trying to get, with funding from sources that has to be raised, have reopened inquests and turned around. And through these inquests, and we have uncovered, or they have uncovered, we now know that there was political interference and that there was an actual political instruction to stop the investigations.
Let me ask you something. What happened to the mass movement that made possible the end of apartheid and the other pillars of the defeat of the apartheid? What happened to the mass movement? How mass movement react to this kind of
Well, you see, you've got a very well-organized civil society during the time of apartheid.
Yeah.
Despite the repression, despite the illegality of working above ground, Then your ANC is unbanned, and the UDF was really a front for the ANC. Then it's unbanned. Then the leadership is returning from exile. Political prisoners are being released. There are the top brass of the ANC meeting with senior officials around the table to sort out the negotiations. The masses are excluded. But hopeful, tired, battle-worn. So finally we've got what we've needed. We've needed our leadership. They're here now, and we'll vote them in. In 1994, we'll have this, what was a mass...
Yes, it was wonderful.
Wonderful moment.
Yeah.
But do we have the skill to govern a country? Does this ANC, the people newly elected, policy is another exercise altogether, and going through all the green and papers and laws that had to be changed. It was a huge exercise, despite this, constitution that was also a beautiful document that was put in place in 1996. So people backed the ANC. They voted for the ANC. And then thought, life is going to get better. This is what we fought for. We fought for our ANC. It's going to get better now. And remained loyal to the ANC. And then, after the first 4 years, and the second 4 years, getting another president in, impeaching one, getting another one in, and so forth, we, I think, the masses of people, some are still incredibly loyal and will vote for the ANC and will proudly wear the colors of the ANC, black, green, and gold. But others are disillusioned and are on the streets organizing around social delivery, service deliveries, escalation, spike in the number of protests that are happening, because this is not what we dreamed of. This is not the South Africa that we wanted, with tiny little matchbox houses, tiny, they're called RDP houses, this mass housing scheme implemented by the new government, on very tiny plots of land. And you're talking about largely people who have had livestock and have been also planted their food. There's no land for that. Everyone's on top of each other. It's a chaos. Our communities are in chaos. They're completely swamped with brick and zinc and trying to make ends meet with no jobs, no prospects. It's miserable. This is not what we fought for. This is not what the masses rose up for. So we have a new president at the helm now, Ramaphosa. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be a little bit more hope, because Jacob Zuma was a complete disappointment and embarrassment with the embezzlement and corruption that went under his watch, by him included. So all of this is coming out in commissions. I think that if you are able to listen to the radio, and it's broadcast live, these commissions, we're not in the greatest space at all at the moment. But at least we have systems in place that can allow for the rot to come to the fore. And that keeps me hopeful. And I've always had hope in people. change has never come from the top and any society. So we know what we must do if things, when they need to happen, you know what I mean? That there's a new wave of activism through the Fees Must Fall, free education campaign. Getting a degree in South Africa is a very expensive business and completely out of the range of black people. Without scholarships, you know, it's very, very difficult and a huge sacrifice and debt that will keep you strangled for a lifetime. So, you know, there are new waves. There are new waves. There's thinking around decolonization, which is very important. And so young people are thinking about and mobilizing around a new agenda. That makes me hopeful. Harun, this young boy, this baby who was tortured with me, has risen through the adversity. In fact, adversity builds character, and he's doing wonderful, wonderful work with his artistic expression. He's a comrade, I would say. And we have I have a beautiful daughter who's. All of this makes her a little bit anxious, actually. Some of the time we are just together, and you know, you don't really know what's around the corner in our country, whether it's crime or whether it's some kind of sinister, more right-wing retaliation. You don't know. You don't know really what's around the corner. But I am very fulfilled in the work I do at the Human Rights Media Center. We started this book project 6 years ago, and I was really grateful that a big publisher like Penguin Random House picked up this manuscript that was 800 pages, and we brought it to this book, because I think these stories are important for our people in South Africa, but also in Brazil, and also in other countries, because no democracy comes on a plate. And you can never let down your guard, ever.
Do you believe that the apartheid still has roots in South Africa? The inequality is still very high. Is apartheid dead, or it still has some signs in South African society?
Well, the laws have been scrapped, but the remnants of apartheid are incredibly visible in the layout of the landscape. So you will still have the white population living in the best, most fertile places in the country. In my hometown, they'll be close to the mountain or hugging the sea, the coast. Whereas poor people live in the Cape Flats. I'm included in that lot. Through choice. But I'm living within my means, actually. I'm not earning a lot, and I couldn't afford to live anywhere else. So I'm living within my means, and I think that's what you have to do in life, don't you? So our communities are racially divided. There's a small movement of black middle class and elite moving up into what was the top end of the triangle. enjoying the spoils by the rich whites. But on the bottom, you still have the black majority. And underneath that triangle, you have the invisible refugee community. So there's, at that very lower end, there's that squabble and scramble for the limited resources. So it plays out as xenophobia, but it's just a complete struggle to survive, actually. It's quite tragic that there are these manifestations of xenophobia in our country, but it's really about poverty. And it's probably also that most South Africans have never actually, the majority have never moved from one province to the other, let alone across the border. And that's what we have. We need to have an Africanist perspective. And we need to understand the struggles of Rwanda, DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi, and the poverty in Zimbabwe, to understand that we're going to have a flow of people coming to our country because they're desperate. And we're going to have to share what we've got. We've done it before. We have that spirit of Ubuntu, but without that deeper engagement and understanding of the issues of the continent, we have this very reactionary response from what is poor people.
What would you say is the legacy of Nelson Mandela for the young generations? But the image of the Nelson Mandela nowadays is still strong, and the South African knows well that the struggle against apartheid includes armed revolts and such a thing, or it's just a pacific movement. That's the way many people want to see the fight against apartheid, or a peaceful. What's the vision of this history regarding the knowledge of the young generations?
Well, let me just conclude firstly that inequality is still deeply entrenched along racial lines. And the youth of today, sometimes called strangely, it doesn't make sense to me, the born frees, those born after 1994, because we haven't freed ourselves from the shackle of capitalism, or even racial capitalism. It's still there, and the Truth Commission should have really imposed a wealth tax to increase the revenue of a compensation and
a land reform.
Well, yes, that's another whole process in itself, but it's been very sluggish and complicated. But so, you know, whatever the rich had during apartheid, they still have post-apartheid, and there's opportunities for black people to become players in the economics of capitalism and get rich. Even our president is one of the 10th richest people in the country. He had
from the
trade union movement, and then became involved in mining, among the other profitable. So young people, some say Nelson Mandela is a sellout. that we live with a structural adjustment program, which is actually not what we need. And life is no better. So we entered into an arrangement, or a peace arrangement that sold out. So there are people that say that. There are young people that say that. And, it's not Mandela. It's not one person, actually. We all have to do our bit. I think it's a mistake to place so much emphasis on leaders and not actually memorialize the smaller community people who gave everything for our freedom, and to have much more of that evident for people to have confidence in democracy and sacrifice. Mandela's shoes are very big to fill, and you can look up to him, but it's the local leaders that have to be honored. We have to devolve memory work locally, as this book does, actually. It's a mixed bag, in answer to your question, how people feeling, and I think they're loyal. They're people that are still incredibly loyal to the ANC. They will die ANC no matter what. And there are others that don't vote for the ANC and are not really confident in any of the other parties, so are in a bit of a limbo and political demoralization. But I do think that we've got to think about a new social order, how we can fix this, because this is a problem not in South Africa, it's a problem here in Brazil, is what economic order would and could and should work here. We've got to put our heads together again. We can't have these old models that haven't worked properly. Neither capitalism doesn't work, and communism has had serious problems with in the way it's been implemented. But there's so many good things about it, and socialism, and what kind of new social order do we need? I think we have to rethink. We have to really not just copycat, but rethink. That's what we need. That's what the world needs, I think.
Bom, pessoal, a gente conversou aqui com a Shirley Gunn, que foi militante na luta contra o apartheid na África do Sul. Hoje é diretora do Centro de Mídia sobre Direitos Humanos na África do Sul e está aqui no Brasil participando de um encontro da RESLAC, que é a Rede Latino-Americana e Caribenha de Lugares de Memória. Então, ela nos contou aqui um pouco dessa história de resistência, de luta contra o racismo, de luta em defesa da democracia e de como ainda há muitos desafios pela frente, né, para o povo da África do Sul, para o povo do Brasil, para o povo do mundo inteiro, para conquistar essas coisas tão sonhadas, né, a justiça, os direitos humanos, melhores condições de vida, a igualdade, né. Enfim, toda essa conversa então fica aqui disponível no nosso canal de vídeo, o Tutameia TV, e o nosso trabalho está ancorado no site Tutameia, o endereço é tutameia.jor.br. E quando a gente se encaminha para o fim, a gente vai pedir aqui a mensagem da Shirley para o nosso povo aqui que está nos assistindo, para o Brasil. So, you'd like to have your final message for the people that are with us here, for the people who may see this program anytime. So, what do you say? Is there hope?
I'm an optimist. I will never give up hope. I will never give up hope. I have confidence in people. I think that we can come through this dark period. I think we can. And it's going to require all of our efforts, and we're going to have to think cross-regionally to come up with solutions. We can't think in our silos about our solutions.
Great.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you,
So
thank
much.
you. Does that make sense? How does it go? Oh, is that on air? Was it on air?
No, that's good.